FM,
Indiana, I'm sure. Illinois,
and its tenants. And now, to address legal concerns of our community, AM 1310 The Light presents Legally Speaking. Here is today's host.
Good morning. Good morning to our very station, 1310, 92.7, our internet customers, our people that watch us on YouTube. Thank you for listening today. Along today, I'm going to have my superstar panel of guests, Milton Grimes, the great lawyer from LA, and attorney Vanita Banks, a superstar lawyer from Chicago, originally from Indianapolis, I might add. But before I get started today, I'm concerned. I wanted to take a simple trip to New Orleans, and I looked at the paper, and I discovered they were having an average of 4 carjackings per day. People stop at stop signs, red lights, and I want to go out and play golf. And I was thinking to myself, when I looked at the area, I said, this is crazy. And then I started looking at statistics, Milton and Vanita, and it just startled me, the number of carjacks. When I look at Philly and places like that, it's something that kind of bothered me. And I'm thinking, one of the most violent crimes that you could have is probably carjacking. You're in your car, you stop at a red light, somebody put a gun to your head. I mean, what could be worse than that? I'm thinking, and then, you kicked out of your own car, your personal items and things like that. I just don't get it. It's just a terrible ordeal. But then before I woke up this morning and on TV, they have the same type issue in California, this crime rate that pillaging our neighborhoods and stuff. I watch in LA, the governor's out cleaning up railroad tracks because people, quote, burglarize trains in Attorney Grimes' neighborhood. And, we have the same problem here in Indianapolis. This crime wave, it just bothered me. We got to talk about the bill today in the Senate installed, but this crime wave thing just bothered me this morning. And I couldn't sleep when I kept watching it. Counselors, I don't know that you've been paying attention to this crime wave lately. It just bothered me more so than most time because it's so cold. I can't go out. So I watch the news, people killing each other.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Good morning, Ms. Banks. I didn't speak earlier, but you can.
Good morning, Attorney Grimes.
Good morning,
Attorney Lee.
Yeah, good morning. You know what hit me? It like I said briefly. How do I say this without trying to sound like a philosopher? But the value system always go up and down, I guess. But there's an obvious change in our value system here in this country, and that is line prevail, injustice prevail, even though we've had a few trials here and there scattered around the country where we've gotten some symbol of justice. Overall, people are losing confidence in the justice system, and it's eroding. Its erosion is right in our eyes. I mean, I saw a 70-year-old woman, a nurse, Black nurse, been a nurse at the same hospital for 38 years, kept to herself, did her job, everybody honored her. She was killed at a bus stop, punched to death. She got the back page of the paper. A young white girl, 24 years old, was killed in a furniture store, and she got front page headline, and the city offered $250,000 reward for the capture of her killer. A little 16-year-old girl, it was in the paper today, she gets killed and dumped on the freeway. She doesn't even get the back page of the paper. So I say that to say that maybe people are just coming to their end on acceptance of on acceptance of disrespect and a lower value system in our country. So I don't know if it starts with, look at all this crime, look at what the base is for this crime and what created this situation. I'm not saying I'm right, I'm just saying that's my observation. I don't know how to explain all this crime other than there's people are without jobs because of closure of businesses in this pandemic, and it's coming to this result. So I throw all that out. I don't want to take up all the time.
Well, so the homicide rate was the worst in American history the first 2 years of Trump presidency. For every 100,000 people, we had 5.39 people murdered in the United States under Trump 2 years. in terms of being the president. So the homicide rate is actually dropped, but these other crimes have escalated. And that was the whole point of that. Oh, Attorney Banks, sorry for cutting you off.
Not at all. That was an excellent point that you just made, Attorney Lee. Vehicular hijacking, which is commonly referred to as carjacking, it's become an epidemic across the nation. And city and state officials are seeing increased incidents since the start of COVID-19, since the beginning of the pandemic. In Chicago, vehicular hijacking is a Class 1 felony, and aggregated vehicular hijacking is a Class X felony. And of course, there's varying sentencing terms based on the severity of the circumstances involved. But there's not a day that goes by that you don't see news about carjackings, many times involving teenagers executing these crimes. And I'm just looking at a statistic from 2020, because we're just with COVID-19, these carjackings have continued to escalate for many of the reasons that Attorney Grimes stated. But I'm looking at statistics showing that in 2020, and these aren't the latest, but just to give you an example, that carjackings increased by 135% over the prior year, 2019, from 603 to almost 1,400. And so again, I agree with you, Attorney Lee, that these carjackings across the nation are incredibly concerning.
But those are just, to me, they're just symptoms of a deeper problem, and that is what's causing this collapse in respect for authority and the law. And, I got some criminal cases that it would take me all day to give some explanation for the cause of it, but it really does go right back to the family structure being broken down for a lot of these young people, and loss of respect for our laws, or no respect for our laws if they ever had it. We're not doing our job at the base of this foundation, Nate.
Well, see, my concern is that we have this murder that was committed in, in Michigan. And I saw that was one of the first time that they are charging the parents with the crime also. And I thought that was significant because a lot of people don't recognize in terms of, and I do the civil liability, and I'm not involved with the criminal, I'm not a criminal lawyer, I do civil liability. But what happens is, like carjackings are oftentimes committed using pistols and things like that, weapons. And most parents don't realize that their pistol could impose secondary liability on them. I've been able to collect millions of dollars in cases where teenagers utilize the weapons of their parents to cause harm to other people. And the parents have liability because they have a duty to store their weapon in a safe and secure location. And they don't recognize that, But one of the things that I'm not seeing a lot of is that I'm not seeing the parents be held criminally liable for the conduct of their teenage kids. I'm not sure whether you've seen that, Milton, but I'm not personally seen. I'm not sure what Attorney Banks, but in my practice for the last 41 years, I've just not seen it. But we do hold them civilly liable, and I think most parents don't realize that. And so we see this proliferation of carjacking. I think is probably one of the most dangerous crime that could be of all crimes, because you're in your safe space inside of your car. You stop at a red light and somebody put a gun to your head. That's terrifying, I think, because you got a random act of violence for somebody that simply doing it because they can do it. It's just a very frightening thought process in my mind. I hope it doesn't become a norm.
Well, these carjackings are becoming a norm and becoming endemic. I'm looking at right now a headline that's stating an 11-year-old boy arrested for carjacking in Chicago and is a suspect in several other cases. And this is the kind
11-year-old?
Oh, absolutely. In Chicago, there's a plethora of children that are committing these crimes.
Well, that's terrible. Well, on that note, we better change the subject because that's depressing. To think that some 11-year-old kid is out there taking a car, that's just inconceivable.
And he was charged with aggravated vehicular hijacking with a firearm. So you're absolutely right, Attorney Lee. Everybody has to be very, very careful as you are driving your car and stopping at intersections, because again, this carjacking problem has become itself a pandemic.
I've had several cases where the young person, 15, 16, 12 years old, when you look at it in depth, they have been put in that position by an older person who's outside or waiting for them to come with the robbery goods or the cars at another location. I guess it's just, it's not new. It's not new. People have used kids a long time for crime.
Okay.
And to your point about the couple that's being charged in Michigan, I absolutely agree that criminal charges may be unprecedented, and that these prosecutors are being creative, and in my opinion, rightfully so, because at the least, based on what we know about the facts today, which can change, that these parents were potentially criminally negligent for all the reasons that have been stated. First purchasing the gun for the child, negligently failing to keep it locked up, providing it to their son, knowing that he had mental illness problems. What do you think, Attorney Grimes?
Well, oftentimes you don't have culpability of the parents connected with the act of the child. In the rare situations you do, they should be held liable. But, I think the majority of parents want their children to go a crime-free life. The majority of folks, you got some crazy people out there, but I don't think the majority of crimes are supported by parents when they're young people do.
Okay, now change
murder,
the dialogue here. Attorney Banks had raised some interesting things. We had some monumental votes that occurred this week. There has been, since the 2000 election, the mantra being the election was stolen, although it's fundamentally false. We had a record number of people voted in the last election, and there was a clear winner. And the odd thing is that Republicans gained in the House and in certain parts of the country and state offices, and they were on the same ballot as Trump, and they had the merit to say that the election was unfair, even though they had won and he lost. And they neglected the fact that the president approval rating was relatively low, and he was determined to be a chronic liar. I mean, they had tracked his lies, and they went over 10,000 or 30,000, something ridiculous. And so the net result was, so they've had these states enact these draconian voting laws that reminiscent of what we had during the days of Jim Crow. And so what do you think, Attorney Banks? That Senate vote was disappointing.
absolutely disappointing. Not unexpected, but disappointing. We saw the filibuster used to reject voting rights last week on the heels of the celebration of Martin Luther King Jr.'s the anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s the celebration of his birthday. And so the question becomes, what do we do now? And so, as you stated, Attorney Lee, we've seen 19 states pass restrictive voting right laws and voter suppression laws. We've seen bills introduced, such as this bill that would prohibit the teaching or education of students that would make them uncomfortable. We've seen that bill introduced in Florida. We've also seen a bill introduced that would establish a police force under Governor Santos' jurisdiction that would enable police officers to arrest citizens that do not have a voter ID card, or formerly incarcerated people that may be attempting to vote. So we're really seeing, again, a plethora of anti-democratic laws being introduced to deny the fundamental and most important right, which is the right to vote.
Okay, we'll take a quick caller who want to comment on that, Attorney Banks. Okay, caller, you have a comment for us today.
Hey, how you doing, Brother Nate and Attorney Banks, Attorney Grimes, and Brother Motez here, and thanks for taking my time. I'll be brief. Mississippi, all the black senators in Mississippi, as they walked out because the state senate in Mississippi passed the anti-CRT bill too, which we know CRT is not being taught in elementary, junior high schools. It's a shame. I look at my grandchildren's school when they came home the last couple of weeks, and we're learning about pioneers, learning about quilts and stuff like that. Now, one black person is in the picture. Black people have a long history of making quilts. The history of quilting is a direct lineage to enslaved Africans in this country, yet not one picture, not one mention in their books today had any black people. In my opinion, they've done a poor job the last 20 years in the school system of doing any teaching of including African Americans in the history. It's even in the college ranks. We would battle about it all the time on the college campus. We would just flat out battle about it. I went to Lincoln for the first 2 years, but when I came back to Purdue in Hammond, we battled about it. So I think it's been a problem for a long time of the lack of teaching of true United States or United States history. But Nate, I want to ask you guys about the ruling from the federal judge against Donald Trump and the January 6th documents. I think that was a stinging defeat finally to him. And then the ruling from one of his appointees smacking down Biden's vaccine mandate. That was kind of a wash, I guess, this week when we look at our rulings from federal judges. But I was wondering your all's opinion on that, and how do we get this court get into court with issues we have? Because I think a lot of these bills should be brought in court. You got teachers in Oklahoma going to court. You got teachers in various other states going to court. Education systems, ACLU. What does our prospects look like in federal court trying to challenge a lot of these, as Attorney Banks said, anti-democratic issues? And Attorney Banks, I just got back from Florida a couple months ago. What DeSantis is doing, that is citizens he's trying to deputize. He's trying to get deputize citizens and create his own private police force to enact those things. So that's really the danger for what he's trying to do down there. And thanks for taking my time.
May I address you?
Go ahead.
Yeah, in regards to what Vanita Banks said and what this gentleman has said, I was thinking about, this is not the first time. It goes back to Reconstruction when slaves were freed and had the right to vote. And white folks decided, no, we're not going to let them take over this country. We're not going to let them have this much power. This voting right power is too much. We got to take this back. So we're going to start killing them. We're going to do whatever we got to do to intimidate them and stop them from voting. Now they're changing laws. You got to have this and you got to have that. I worked on voting right laws here in California for the last 8 years. I've tried 8 cases on this issue. We just won one against the city of Santa Monica for disenfranchising and polarized voting and discrimination last week. And we are on appeal for that because we won that case that they had disenfranchised Latin vote and Black votes in the city of Santa Monica. And it goes back to the 60s when they built the freeway through the Black neighborhood and displaced Black and Latino families. Now they're talking about giving reparations to these families and asking everybody who can show where their lineage has been in the last 60 years or so, show a connection to the Pico area of Santa Monica, they can get reparations for the loss of the property by their families and the displacement of it. So this is not a new thing that we're dealing with. It's something we're dealing with in California. We got a law that was enacted in 2002, the Voting Rights Act. And Nate, wherever you can show that there's a significant amount of minorities in a particular city, you can pretty much argue against at-large voting and have it districtized, as I call it. And so that minorities, Latin and African Americans and other significant groups where they are centered will have a voice in their government. And so white folks have been fighting against minorities getting voting rights power because they know it will take away their power at the table that's making these great decisions on how the government is in a particular location. So this is not a new thing. I was just an aside reading this book called How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith. And he's talking in this book about a trip he took to Monticello in Virginia, one of Jefferson's slave compounds, plantations, and how he kept watching 2 white women who were there. And every time that the guide would say something about this is a slave quarter, or this is slave, or Sally Hemings, or Jefferson's slave, quote, wife, who he had 6 kids by, the white women would kind of go into a little appearance of shock. So he asked them after the tour, I saw your reaction. Why is that? Now, this is 2 years ago. And they said, we didn't know Jefferson had slaves. Jefferson had over 300 slaves, but our history books don't teach the general public that. It lies to the general public. So people are whites and Blacks. We haven't been taught accurate history here in this country about 1,700 congressmen owning slaves, or just how entrenched white supremacy is in our whole makeup. And that's what I got to say.
Attorney Banks?
And I agree, and our caller made so many points, and I wanted to follow up on the point he made regarding the 8-2 Supreme Court decision this week, which allowed the release of the January 6th files. This is over 750 pages of documents in the case of Trump versus Benny Thompson. This was a petition for injunctive relief to block the release of those documents to the January 6th investigative committee on grounds of executive privilege, which the court did not rule on, but did state that the claims that were made of executive privilege by a former president against an incumbent president were issues of of basically was the first time that such issue was raised to the Supreme Court. But they didn't decide the case on that issue. They decided that these documents should be released, and that his claim of executive privilege was not strong enough to overcome President Biden's decision that Congress has a legitimate need for these documents, that there was a legitimate legislative purpose in requesting these documents to prevent future attacks on democratic institutions in our republic. It was about a one paragraph decision, unsigned opinion, but a very powerful one that will be reviewed, I'm sure, and discussed for many years to come.
Well, I noticed that Justice Thomas dissented, and it's very tragic because one of the principles in our legal system, that the foundation of democracy is something very basic. That is, no man is above the law, not even the president of the United States. Our country is a democracy, not a monarchy, not a communist regime, not a totalitarianism. And so what we see is executive overreach. If the president can insulate himself and commit crimes, and I believe very firmly that on January 6th of 2021, we saw a series of criminal misconduct. But more importantly, we also saw an elaborate plan by someone to overthrow the federal government. And someone would be the sitting president of the United States and his cronies who attempted to do the Green Bay sweep and all these different things. I was watching counsel this on TV, and this lawyer who came up with the strategy to select electors for the electoral college count. And he said on TV that the law has never been challenged, and that if the electors were thrown out, you have to have alternative electors. And I could not believe that when I saw a lawyer say things like that on national TV, and he then say that the vote count was suspect, and so he got on TV and just started making things up. And as a lawyer, you know, we have to rely on evidence. None of the things that he said to justify the creation of this fake board of electors was accurate, not even remotely accurate. And I was thinking to myself, that lawyer probably gonna get in trouble for that, but we'll wait and see.
I doubt that.
I think he will, because they've filed complaints against all those lawyers. They've all been sanctioned or been sanctioned. The lawyers, each of those lawyers are looking at some fate that I think will be adverse to their professional career.
They should, but I doubt it.
Yeah, but I don't have all the statistics on each of the lawyers, but they've started filing these complaints against all those lawyers for the most part, and the federal court sanctioned them, and I think you're going to see state court, and you know, now we had a text from Pierre. He says the congressmen and women who voted against certifying the election, I guess you think that they also engaged in misconduct. It's one thing to vote in a representative capacity, even if you disagree with the vote, they have a right to vote. It's another thing to try to do an act of sedition or insurrection to overthrow the federal government. I think there are two different issues, Pierre. So in other words, when you attack members of Congress, you attack the institution of Congress with bats, chemicals, sticks, stones, whatever, that's a violent act that led to death and significant injuries and damages. Over $500 million in costs was incurred because of this. And yet the people that are being punished, when I was looking at the math, collectively together, they're going to pay out less than $2 million when they enter these plea agreements. But they cause over $500 million in costs to the government. So the point of that is that there is a difference between voting in a representative capacity versus the physical attempt of enacting violence and overthrowing the government. So I think on the one hand, it's protected, and you can't do anything about how a person vote. And because earlier, Attorney Banks pointed out that we had this vote in the Senate this week, and we started off talking about the electoral process, and we're trying to enact the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and we had Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin, the two Democrats, joined with the Republicans, and they blocked the passage of this landmark legislation. So all this stuff we're talking about, voter protection, was included in that bill, and the two Democrats, along with 50 Republicans. And I think that we must make this clear, Attorney Banks and Grimes, particularly in the audience. I thought that the Democrats made a mistake in terms of our leadership. Give you a good example, I think that our leadership made a fundamental mistake, and I hate to say this publicly, but what happened is, for example, the state of Kentucky had a massive loss, one of the worst in their history. People got killed, property just got swept away by the wind. And the person who had been against relief for hurricanes and storm was Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky. When we saw New Jersey got destroyed, he tried to do a one-man filibuster of the process. But here's the point I'm making. If Kentucky needed $2 billion immediately, why didn't the Democrats simply take their George Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Build Back Better and say, okay, we'll give you $4 billion, sign the bill? And I was just stunned that the Democrats didn't play hardball politics, because that's exactly what Rand Paul in Kentucky has done on every hurricane relief. And I didn't get that. And I thought that we made a political mistake.
Interesting and very powerful point, Attorney Lee. And I agree wholeheartedly with your point that there's a difference between voting in your representative capacity. However, if there is evidence that a member of Congress actually collaborated and participated, in the planning of the riotous raid on the Capitol, by either letting rioters in or other forms of collaboration and planning, I believe that they should be held accountable. And those are things that the January 6th committee is investigating and looking at some of these representatives, including McCarthy and others, that they have requested and or subpoenaed to appear before the investigative committee. What we know is that there were approximately 10,000 rioters, that approximately 2,000 illegally entered the building, that 350 are still being sought. I believe I read a statistic that 163 people who believe the big lie, they're now running for state-wide office. We see that 725 charges have been made against individuals in all 50 states. So far, only 70 sentences. Most have pled guilty of crimes such as, trespass, destruction of property, etc. However, we are of late seeing charges and we've talked about this on earlier shows, we saw last week a charge of seditious conspiracy being brought by, I believe, one of the members of the Oath Keepers. And we also saw a sentence of 3.5 years for one of the QAnon leaders that participated in the raid on the Capitol on January 6th.
Well, you know what, Nate, history has shown that if you control the narrative, you can pretty much sway opinions out there. And the narrative on this issue of January the 6th is, I believe, is that they were exercising their democratic rights to protest. And it wasn't an overthrow of the government. Whether you and I and Ms. Banks believe that or not, there are millions of people out here who believe that and support that. And so the narrative is still that, and they're going to have the benefit of that continuing lie, that presenting that lie as a justification for their actions and laugh at us, even though they know that's not the truth. So that's the power of that narrative. Just as they, in a reading of mine some time ago, Robert E. Lee and me, about the Southern narrative of the South won the Civil War. The South won the Civil War. The Union won that battle out there on the field, but the South won it. And a lot of people still believe that throughout this country. So their narrative is they were exercising their democratic rights on January the 6th. And I don't know, all jurors that sat in that box are not going to believe that they were committing treason or an act of a crime. They're going to believe they were demonstrating their rights. So that's what we got. People are running for office based on that lie, like Vanita just said.
Well, the interesting thing, though, is that they've not tried any of those cases, despite having some pretty overwhelming evidence.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I would like to have seen at least one trial that the government put on in this process, because what occurs during the trial, it forces the lawyers to get all the relevant evidence. And by doing the trial preparation, you then do more investigation, is more target specific. And then we have this concurrent parallel investigation going on by the House, but the House investigation does not have the same teeth as the lawyer doing the criminal litigation. They have the subpoena power that could be enforced immediately by a federal judge. And I was thinking about that. I thought that what should have happened, and I would like to see some of those cases tried. You know,
you're believing, you believe what you want to believe, but you're arguing that the truth is going to set us free, so to speak. The truth is going to show what happened. When you're controlling the narrative, you really don't care what the truth is. You just keep telling that lie over and over again, even in the face of the evidence. So,
and I hate to use the label Republicans anymore because I don't think it's an accurate description. But I've always thought that Republicans, traditional Republicans, were always great at messaging, much better than Democrats, and
right.
have always been very astute at creating and articulating a narrative.
That's
and
right.
beginning with a false premise,
That's right.
stating a false premise as true, right? Or stating the opposite of truth,
right.
Such as we must protect our children from being taught critical race theory in their schools. They set that out as a premise. It's a false premise. Critical race theory is a concept that was created by legal scholars to address systemic racism in institutions back in the 70s. But that's not being taught in K through 12 curriculum, period. But it's set out there as a truth. For example, another example, that we are all for voting rights, and every citizen in this country has the fundamental right to vote. That's what the 1965 Voting Rights Act accomplished. You know, so they start from a false premise they articulated. And many people, as you stated, Attorney Grimes, they believe the premise. And of course, social media, and we didn't have terms such as, quote, misinformation and disinformation and alternative facts we didn't even have those terms, I would say, 5 years ago?
Right.
I don't even think those terms were part of those terms, I believe, came into the popular culture, if you will, with
Trump.
number 45.
Yeah.
Okay, and now we'll take a quick caller on this issue. Somebody want to comment? Okay, caller, you have a question or comments for us today?
Yeah, my comment is to Attorney Grimes, Attorney Banks, and of course you, Mr. Lee. You know, you're talking about controlling the narrative, and you're talking about information. We started the show, or at least you started the show, with all the killing going on in different communities from here in Indiana all the way out to the West Coast, and obviously up in Chicago. So Attorney Grimes and Attorney Banks, and Nate, I know you already know this, but when I get up in the morning, I turn on my news, the narrative's already controlled, because before they leave with anything else, they were shooting. And I think that's what's impacting our community. Who is putting this type of information out? Because when they jump to stories about them, they're always positive stories. So I just like your comments about that. What's going on in LA? What's going on in Chicago? And maybe if you address the Indianapolis area, I'd appreciate it. Thanks, I'll listen.
Wow, that's a powerful question there. That's a great question, Milton.
Yeah, it is. And that's the headline in today's paper. Who's of value in the United States? And as I tried to say,
Wow.
when we started, we know who that is, and we know who it is not, as demonstrated in this recent death in LA of 3 women. And who got a front page notification and picture? The white, I won't say little because that's condescending, the 24-year-old white girl. Front page of the LA Times. And down at the bottom of the page in a little box, they said the lady got killed at the bus stop by a homeless person. The white girl got killed by a homeless person. And then go to page 4 for the lady that got killed by the homeless person. That's the black lady, a nurse who's been working 38 years at the same hospital. So who controls the narrative? Nate, you know who controls the narrative.
Attorney Banks, I'll let her comment first.
No, I agree wholeheartedly. What you just stated, Attorney Grimes, we see every day here in Chicago. We do see, and across the nation, we do see efforts to focus on positive stories in our communities, in some of the news let me just say, in a small segment of the news coverage, but it's so inequitable and reflective of the exact example that you raised, Attorney Grimes.
It's subliminal. No, it's not subliminal. It's right in our face. It's right in our face.
Well, one of the things is that we have to ensure that we have representation at all levels of the public dissemination of news. And we have a problem in the sense that I agree with you in the sense that the coverage sometimes to me does not and is not fair. However, but we still have a problem that persists. That is that these crimes are still occurring, and too many of these crimes are adversely affecting our community, and I'm getting sick of it. You know, we have, when I grew up, in the day, the community actually looked out for you. Families meant something, and your neighbors were your friends. Now we have too many times whereby we have social media and stuff. We see this proliferation of violence that's out of control. So I think the caller made some very good points. But and on the other hand, though, I like to see a common effect, and I want us as a community to start work to decrease the violence that we are seeing. I'm just sick of it, quite frankly. And I just wish that we could work together to try to solve our problem peacefully without killing somebody. In the old days, you used to could when you had a disagreement, you had a fight, you shook hands, and then you made up. Now it's a gun. Differences are final decisions instead of trying to resolve the problem. And so I think that we have to move forward and try to address this issue in our communities. Now, the other issue, though, is this critical race theory that I keep getting messages about. I agree with Attorney Banks, but throughout my professional career, I never had a course or a lecture that mentioned the word critical race theory. And I went to college, grad school, and professional school, and at no point did I ever hear that term. But what I did learn, I took a course in African American history, and I learned about the slave trade and things like that. It was never taught in my traditional classes as I look back, but I did take specialized classes to learn the history of our people as they was brought over in ships to America over 400 years ago. So the point I'm making is that if you poll maybe 1,000 lawyers, I wonder how many lawyers actually had a class on critical. I know I did. I don't know whether or not you guys did. Do you have a class on critical race theory at any point?
No, not that theory, but just knowledge of race and slavery.
At no time in my educational career did I have a course or was I made aware of the term, quote, critical race theory. I became knowledgeable about critical race theory many years after law school by becoming aware of the work of the attorneys that created the theory, one of which is the great and brilliant Derek Bell, as well as Kimberly Crenshaw. But at no time in my formal education curriculum was the term addressed.
And it was amazing to me that this became a successful campaign process in Virginia governor's race, despite the fact that it was not even taught in Virginia schools. Glenn Youngkin became governor based upon this educational issue. We're going to stop critical race theory from being taught in school. And then they have the temerity to cite Dr. Martin Luther King, who had aspirational goals of every person being judged by the content of their character versus the color of their skin. And then they reversed that aspirational goal to say that, I guess they would use that to say you can't have affirmative action, everything else, ignoring the fact that what we're really talking about is aspirational. Here's what we were trying to get in America. We're not there yet, but I hope and pray that we continue to have improvement. We have a lot of people that are working very hard, both white, blacks, Hispanic, to make sure that we have some transition to a more fair country. But we're not there at 100% yet. But we have to continue to work on that. But this idea.
I want to just.
Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to clarify that, again, I never heard the term during, from K through 12, and I didn't wasn't familiar with the term, nor was critical race theory taught in my law school. But that's not to say that critical race theory was not a course taught in law schools. You know, in fact, it originated in, you know, some law schools and by some law professors. And so I'm sure that there were courses taught. I'm just saying that I didn't take a course.
Yeah, the term I don't think it wasn't known by me until recent times. So I go a little further back in education than you guys. I'm a day or two older than you.
Well, I did some quick research. This little quick research said that it was first introduced in education discipline in 1995. Mm-hmm. You know, but the weird thing about it, I was just looking at the Wikipedia. It was saying that it was first introduced in 1995, so that would have been way after I was done with my educational pursuits. Mm-hmm. But I think that the weird thing, I first recognized this as being a viable issue only in the last 4 or 5 years. You know, it just kind of popped up into the America vernacular, and all of a sudden it exploded, became this hotbed issue. And it's just amazing to me. We had people dying every day with COVID. You know, we don't have that under control. We have a third of the population don't believe in that. And then they get motivated by critical race theory. I just don't get it. But
again, the manipulation and articulation and control of the narrative. This is a classic example of that.
Okay, we reach our closing comment. Any words of wisdom in our closing conduct today, or our closing comment today, Attorney Banks or Grimes? Go ahead.
Let me just say briefly, speaking of the critical race theory, you know, in a recognized institution that's in the forefront in our country, I think we have one African-American coach out of 30 teams in professional football today.
32 teams, that's correct.
That's right, 32 teams. So we got a critical race issue still in our presence, y'all, today, as indicated by that situation. So we got a lot of work to do. And that's all I can say. We got to keep working at it.
Attorney Banks?
I would just say that while we're disappointed in the results of the vote earlier this week, we must continue to mobilize to ensure that every citizen in our nation is able to exercise our fundamental right to vote. We can't be discouraged. John Lewis was not discouraged. Martin Luther King Jr. was not discouraged. We can't stay home. That can't be an alternative. We have to continue to mobilize on this issue, this fundamental issue of voting rights in America.
Thank you.
Great point. Now, in conclusion, there's two important issues, our audience. First, my hearts, and we all agree that it was a tragedy that happened in New York City. In the last couple of days, 4 officers were murdered by assailants, and we're really sad to see things like that. You know, one dealt with a guy just shot 3 officers. Just terrible that we have these type of tragedies occurring, these acts of violence. But so, you know, we don't believe in this violent conduct, no matter who is doing it. Death is wrong. These killings are just bad. The second thing, though, on a local issue, I want to make sure that everybody's aware politics is local, and the people in Indianapolis, you need to have a voice in your electoral process and get off the couch and maybe sign up to be a precinct committee person, whether you're a Republican or Democrat. You have to go and fill out the form through the clerk office, form SEL 105. With, you know, there's like 1,200 of these positions, and they decide who become the elected officials by the political party. And I think that we need to have more of you participating in the process. So you can call my office if you need more information, or call the clerk's office and get the form filled out. Well, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for listening today, particularly our special VIP guests. Thank you. And next week, we'll have a show probably on Social Security, and then we'll be back in February. Thank you and have a blessed day.
Good day, y'all.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye.